Welcome to our second day of our panel series, which is entitled Past and Present Atrocities in Ukraine. Can they be qualified as genocide and how? This is a second event following up on our event last May, which we have recorded as we will record this event and posted to our official Fulbright Ukraine YouTube channel. We encourage everyone here to post questions in the chat while our speakers are presenting, or wait and raise your hand towards the end so that our moderator can be sure everyone's questions are addressed. We have lots going on at Fulbright Ukraine. Just wanted to make an announcement to let everybody know that our scholar application deadline for Ukrainian scholars is still open. It doesn't close until October. So if you are thinking about applying, please apply. We continue to receive lots of applications across all of our programs, and we have information about those deadlines on our website. So we are still up and running. And we hope that we will have additional events, panels related to this important topic. We all, as a thinking and acting community, are here gathered at a time of obvious concern about what's happening in Ukraine. So those of you who may be, in a situation where you need to conserve energy or you need to sign off, please know that this is recorded and will be posted, so you can revisit at any time. Without further ado, I would like to turn over our discussion today to our first moderator and our first panel. Dr. Sophia Wilson is here with us. She is based at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, Illinois. So Dr. Wilson, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here as we all pondering and rethinking what does this war mean and what are all the tragic consequences. Just this week, we heard that there were approximately 10 million people in Ukraine who are without electricity. But what does this number really mean? How many infants will not be born because they will not get appropriate medical aid during complicated labor? How many people will not be helped during their heart attack? How many people and children will have their injuries not treated, and they will end, and that would end to tragic consequences? How many people will have shortage of food? This week, there were lots of news discussing in Ukraine, realizing that lots of food that they're buying in the store is probably spoiled because it was not properly refrigerated. Really, the extent to which people are affected on a daily basis and their lives and security are affected on a daily basis, it is very hard to comprehend for all of us. But as we are contemplating about so many deaths and so much suffering in Ukraine, when we turn to Russian media, we hear Solovyov, who just a couple days ago said, the news from Kherson was so bad for Russia. So hearing about the rocket attacks and destruction of infrastructure, it was pleasant, he said. And when I hear that, I automatically remembered a scene from Schindler's List, when one of those in charge of the concentration camp, as he was moving on with his daily routine, then he simply got up and he shot one of the people in the concentration camp. It seemed just for fun. And as I'm thinking about Ukraine and the way that Russian propagandists talk about how much sick pleasure they are experiencing publicly, and what it means. Does it help us understand the genocidal nature of the Russian invasion? And today, this is what we're here for, to hear from scholars and contemplate about the meaning of the concept of genocide from Kristina Hook. We will hear about geopolitical causes of global resistance to admit that this is indeed a genocide, and about historic legacies that are affecting Russia-Ukraine relations today, and we'll hear that from Gennadi Pobere̶ny. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Kristina Hook, who is an assistant professor of conflict management at Kennesaw State University School of Conflict Management, Peace Building and Development. She's an anthropologist and scholar practitioner specializing in large-scale violence against civilians, including genocides and mass atrocities, as well as emerging forms of warfare and violence. She was a Fulbright U.S. Student Program Fellow at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy in 2018-2019. She's a specialist in Ukraine and Ukraine-Russia relations, and has worked in 25 countries, including across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. Her current book project explores the dynamics and legacy of the Soviet-era Holodomor genocide, including how these events influence modern interpretations of current Russia-Ukraine war. Thank you very much, Dr. Hook. We're looking forward to learning from you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Thank you to our Fulbright organizers, and thank you for so many familiar faces and names who are here with us today. It is, I think, helpful to sometimes mention that part of my background, that I had worked in many countries before really beginning to focus and specialize just in Ukraine and its relationships with Russia. Because when I first started working in Ukraine, I was drawn by the case of the Holodomor. That this was nearly 8 years ago, and I had written a lot on genocides and mass atrocities around the world, and was really interested 8 years ago in learning more about a topic that's now defined my career. And I just mentioned that because I think so many of us have had our professional identities shift in different ways, and it is really, I think, we're stating that it is, to me, a huge tragedy that now we are having this panel where I'm discussing comparative genocide studies in the context of what's happening right now. And so I thought that I would just preface my comments by saying that, you know, I believe and I expect that when these crimes are punished in a court of law, there will be a variety of prosecutions happening for things like war crimes, crimes against humanity, and I believe the crime of genocide, and that these are all equally heinous, that there is no kind of moral hierarchy. They're just different types of phenomenon that will be prosecuted in a court of law. And so while I'm restricting my comments to the analysis in the crime of genocide in Ukraine right now, I also want to mention that there are many other layers of atrocities that are happening, and it's worth noting that as well. And so I did think that I would restrict my comments to discussing genocide, because sometimes there is just a little confusion, or even just different ways that this term is used across fields that are sort of helpful for those of us gathering. I see many different perspectives already in the audience of people I know. So it is a concept that is used by academics like me. We work to understand genocides both around the world and then as well as in past and present Ukraine. I look at genocide for the purpose of understanding this phenomenon of violence so that we can better address it through our policy solutions. And that's something that I'll discuss today, why I think understanding what's happening as genocide has real policy implications. There are others who specialize in bringing this crime to the court of law. So they're looking for specific things that can indicate for legal purposes this crime. It's also used by actors like social memory actors, civil society, to commemorate it, or for politicians to call for advocacy and recognition for governments. And so because of that, there is just sometimes the way that this word is used by different actors for different purposes. Another common misconception that I see about genocide is this implicit assumption that it is somehow tied to numerical thresholds for victims. So sometimes you'll hear language kind of colloquially like, oh, the violence looks to be in genocidal proportions, kind of implying that for some people that there must be some kind of numbers aspect happening, some idea that perhaps if it's really bad violence or if it's many people being killed, it might somehow be genocidal. And I would argue that going back to the roots of our field and what's the last 70 years of scholarship that was born out of the Holocaust, that was born out of the Nuremberg trials, that really it's better to understand genocide as a specific pattern of violence. Genocide has been called the crime of crimes because it's seen as targeting a group's most basic right, which is their right to exist. And so I bring that up because when I talk about genocide in contemporary Ukraine that's being waged by Russian perpetrators against the Ukrainian national group, I bring up the killing and the horrific violence that's occurring, but I also bring up this aspect of forced Russification, that both of those are threatening the Ukrainian national group's most basic right to exist. And so I also kind of bring a comparative genocide lens to look at the overall patterns that help us understand, is it genocide or is it one of these other crimes that, again, I think is equally heinous and should also be prosecuted. And some of the things that I look for when I approach a case is I draw from two areas of consensus in our field. And so despite a lot of disagreement in the scholarly field of comparative genocide, there is core agreement around two key questions that you're looking to answer. The first is you are looking for this destructive nature. So you're not just looking for violence that seeks to harm, to repress, to batter, to injure. You're looking for violence that through either direct killing or through forced Russification is threatening a group's right to exist, is threatening to destroy it. The other thing that we're looking for is a kind of, it's unqualified group selection of violence. So undifferentiated might be another way to say that. And what I mean is in other heinous cases that I've worked, you might see perhaps just a group of teenage boys that are targeted in a certain case. Teenage boys can be viewed by perpetrators as future combatants, and it's heinous, but that's really targeting a certain segment of the population. For a genocide, you see that more broadly. You see things like threatening the future descendants of the group. You see violence that doesn't discriminate across any particular subset of the group as defined in the perpetrator's mindset, but that's going after many people. And so we're seeing both of those things in Ukraine. Now, those big key questions can be further tailored down. So in my academic work, I'm not going to get into it here, but in my academic work, we work with proxy variables in the record. We look for, say, okay, so they're going after with a group of destruction. What indicators and perpetrator decision-making or behavior might help me get to that place of seeing it as destruction? And so a lot of my work is around that type of perpetrator ideology, perpetrator decision-making. But I can give a few examples of things that I'm seeing now that were deeply concerning to me from the beginning. When you have perpetrators that are operating from a genocidal ideology, they go to often greater inconveniences, they take greater risks, they go to greater effort. So let's just say instead of perhaps violence that would seek to just scare people, that might be done through, let's say, throwing a bomb in a marketplace and running away where perpetrators could easily get away. What we've seen on the Russian side is perpetrators who are going to a lot more effort. They're setting up filtration camps. They're also behaving in ways that they don't allow often civilians to just simply flee. Now that's significant for me. If you were just allowing civilians to flee from a perpetrator mindset, you might say that their sort of goal of the violence is achieved. The people are fleeing, you can have their stuff, you can have their land, you can have control over their community. But when you begin to pursue victims, there's a deeper logic at play there. There's a deeper indication that the goal of the violence is to do something to those people themselves. And that becomes very, very worrying. It's also something that I saw as an atrocity prevention case officer when I was working against the Islamic State, against ISIS. They were pursuing the Yazidi people group up a mountain at much greater risk and inconvenience to themselves. So this type of population pursuit is really important. When we're also looking at what's happening now, Obviously, the transfer of children from one group to another is something that fits in with both my scholarly lens when I'm looking at this forced Russification of a very vulnerable segment of the Ukrainian population. It's also something that is covered explicitly by the UN legal definition of genocide. Those are indications of this forced transformation of population, either killing those who can resist or trying to forcibly strip the identity of those you think you can get away with that. I will also mention that when I approach this case as a genocide scholar, it leads to some worrying conclusions based on my analysis that it's genocide for reasons of the violence itself, the specific modes of torture that's being used, the indications that we're getting of perpetrator logics behind the violence, even in such a way that they're behaving in ways that don't make sense if it's not explicitly targeting the population. And two of the big challenges that we face, that I would argue we face because this is genocide, have to do with the network of actors that are involved to carry out a genocide. And it also has to do with the specific things that tend to work to stop a genocide in motion and things that don't. So just to mention who is involved in carrying out a genocide. This is something that's been extensively studied in other cases. So I started out my career, as many genocide scholars do, 15 years ago, looking a lot at the Holocaust. And there's been a lot of sophisticated work done in the constellation of bureaucracies that was required to carry out genocidal directives in the Holocaust. It takes a lot of systemization. It takes a lot of coordination. We're looking very closely at indications we have, for example, of filtration camp planning before the February full-scale invasion. But as we know, and many of us here, there's been a lot of sensitivity around calling this, let's say, Putin's war, because we know that the logic that's driving this violence is beyond one man, even beyond him and his inner circle, that there is a deeper logic at play. As Sophia brought up so rightly, that there is a celebration that is happening by people on the Russian side about what's happening. And that's because in a genocide and other types of atrocities, but especially for the level of coordination and systemization that genocide requires, perpetrators do not just include those who are doing the direct violence. So we can talk about those as the direct perpetrators, but there are other roles that people play in carrying out the coordination of a genocide. And that includes, for example, people we would talk about in the language of organizers of a genocide. So we might look at here Russian bureaucrats, officials serving in the administration of occupied areas, military recruiters, planners, advisors, consular officers, or the sort of children's services, I use quotations, who are involved in forcibly deporting both the children and the adult population of Ukraine. All of these would also fall under that category that we look at for organizers of a genocide, as in the Holocaust and in other cases as well. We would also look at authorizers, and that's where I would look at the specific role that Putin is playing, because he is the leader of an authoritarian, increasingly totalitarian state. So he is in a category of having a lot of influence over the situation. And so authorizers would range from both his decision-making and his inner circle to also the field commanders who sign off on genocidal directives, the targeting of civilian populations. All of these would fall under that category as well. I would also look at genocide enablers, and that, Sophia, you've set it up really nicely to look at the role of really virulent, hateful, dehumanizing language coming from key media figures, also coming from religious leaders, very unfortunately, leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, including its head. And so they dehumanize Ukrainians routinely. They routinely call for their extermination, and so they certainly have a role that we look at very carefully. And then also, unfortunately, very unfortunately, what we tend to see in genocides is that there's a key role of bystanders. So I'm thinking here of the work of James Waller, who's a psychologist colleague of mine who's worked in genocide and who I've discussed this case with. And, he's done a lot with the specific types of social dynamics and psychological transformations that happen in a genocidal context. And one of the things he worries about and has seen in his research that I see unfolding here is the shift that the genocides don't just sort of happen when, you know, certain villains arise in society, but genocides tend to happen when those key figures arise, but are surrounded by a population that through kind of different compounding layers of passivity doesn't stop that rise. And what we also see from this type of research is that there's a transformation in wider society that can happen where violence becomes, let's say, for Russian bystanders, if violence against Ukrainians was once unfortunate but unavoidable in their thinking, it can become even actively beneficial. And so when we see language on the Russian side of saying, we must do this for our children, we must, you know, they'll say some hateful thing against Ukrainians and say they have to go after them for their children, that switched in their mindset from something that was just unavoidable, but kind of unpleasant, to something good that they must do for future generations of Russians. And so I'm also watching that unfold. And I don't want to use up too much of my time. I think I'm approaching about my time limit, but I mention this because genocides are a very complex social phenomenon. And once that genie is let out of the bottle, if you will, it is very challenging to put it back in, even for key authorizing figures, influential figures like Putin, that a social transformation has come in that causes that, you know, again, to use another metaphor, that train to leave the station. It's moving along by the actions, both coordinated and uncoordinated, of a lot of different people on the Russian side, including in Russian society. And that matters because what I argue is that we have a lot of different ways that we can try to sort of pull back an atrocity before it begins to unfold in a very real way as we're watching. And not all ways that we try to work on atrocity prevention have to do with military. But in the Ukrainian context, it's unavoidable. That I have been saying from about March, when I started becoming very concerned about this foreign affairs article that I'm referring to that I wrote. I had submitted that, or had worked on the first draft of it in about May. And I think that some of what I worried about is holding up, that we would expect a kind of doubling down of the Russian side consistently. And because of that, what we've seen with genocides that are actively unfolding is that they do tend to end in a kind of total some sense for one side. So they can end with what might approach a total victory for perpetrators. So we might even look at the Holodomor as almost a total victory, in that certainly people knew about it, but it was so successful, that Stalin was so successful at killing millions of Ukrainians that more people didn't know for many years. You can also look at it as the victims can successfully fight back. Now, post-genocide Rwanda is problematic in many ways, but you can look at that as a case where the sort of military actors aligned with the victim group was able to stop the genocide militarily. And then, of course, in the Holocaust, you see outside interveners playing a critical role. And so I've been calling for, you know, this famous line from the 7-Day War in Israel that was, you know, asked what they needed, what terms of aid, and there's this famous line that it was whatever they asked, that double it and get the job done. And so I've been saying that similar type of really proactive thinking on the Western policymaker side needs to happen, because, you know, we all wish that this wasn't going to end in such a stark way, but unfortunately genocide research tends to indicate that we're at such a stage that this genocide can only be forcibly stopped. So I'll just stop my remarks for now. I want to save lots of time for Q&A and for my other presenters, but thank you very much for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hook, for a very insightful and detailed account. And here we are with all the signs of genocides unfolding. And here we have a reminder that the Genocide Convention, United Nations Genocide Convention, establishes the obligation to prevent and to punish the crime of genocide. However, as Dr. Hook mentioned, we do notice a resistance on behalf of global powers to admit that it's a genocide and to act accordingly. And this leads us to our next presentation by Dr. Paul Danieri, who is a professor of political science and public policy at the University of California, Riverside. For the past 3 decades, his research has focused on Ukraine-Russia relations. He was a Fulbright scholar to Ukraine at the Ivan Franko National University of Lviv in 1993-94. He is the author of Ukraine and Russia, From Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War, and he is currently working on an updated version for which we're all looking forward to. His other books include The Sources of Russia's Great Power Politics, Ukraine and the Challenge of the European Order, and Orange Revolution and Aftermath, Mobilization, Apathy, and the State in Ukraine, as well as Understanding Ukrainian Politics, Power, Politics, and Institutional Design, and finally, Economic Interdependence and Ukrainian-Russian Relations. Dr. Danieri, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to learning from you.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Sophia. Thanks, Kristina, for launching us perfectly. And thanks to Fulbright Ukraine for keeping on doing what you're doing in these incredibly difficult times, and for organizing this conference. I'm in some ways going to pick up where Kristina left off. She mentioned the case of Rwanda. And Rwanda is a good example in that, famously, the United States government and other governments did not want to label the Rwanda case genocide because of the obligation it then created on them to intervene. And that's a good example, unfortunately, of how I think sort of power and interests interact with questions of genocide. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. As Sophia mentioned, I'm doing a new version of my book on the Ukraine-Russia war. And one of the things I felt I had to confront, is this question of, is it genocide? I'm really not a genocide scholar. I'm not an international law scholar. I'm much more of an international politics scholar more broadly. But I had to dig into that question. And so what I say today is partly coming out of the research I did for the book. There's an old argument about international law from the perspective of realist international relations theory, which is international law doesn't really matter. It's nice to talk about, but when the chips are down, right, nobody really follows international law. It can't overcome the power and interests of powerful states. And in many cases, realists would say international law, not only does it not constrain powerful actors, but it becomes a tool of powerful actors. And for example, famously, the war crimes trials that were held after World War II, right, were enforced on the losers of that war by the winners of that war. And so that's kind of the classic realist perspective. Now, there is another view that says that even if international law isn't always enforced, it often doesn't have to be. That's the J.L. Brierley famously argued that almost all states follow almost international law almost all of the time. That's clearly not what's going on here, right? Russia is breaking laws left, right, and center, and it's going to take a long time, I think, to sort through it all. But the case of Russia's crimes in Ukraine is a hard one for international law because Russia is a very powerful state, and the hardest thing has always been to enforce international law on the most powerful states. So I really want to talk about three things then. One is going back sort of to the beginning of how international politics shaped the law on genocide at the outset of the post-World War II period. What prospects there are for bringing Russians to justice for what they've done in Ukraine, and I think you can already get a hint that I'm not super optimistic. But I also want to talk about how the question of dealing with genocide and crimes against humanity and other crimes might shape the peace process, if there ever is one. And we all hope eventually there will be something like that. I'm not actually going to dig too far into the question of whether Russia has or has not committed genocide in Ukraine. I think the answer quite clearly is yes. And if not genocide, then at least certainly crimes against humanity. But ultimately, that's for courts to decide, and I'll leave that for the lawyers to debate. I think the real problem is getting to the place where courts can actually decide that. But I want to go back a little bit, because one of the things that is going to come up in a discussion of whether Russia has committed genocide is the definition of genocide. and especially the sort of a scholarly definition versus the legal definition in the Convention on Genocide. So Raphaël Lemkin, I think we're pretty well aware, all of us. Raphaël Lemkin invented the term genocide, really thinking about not only what the Nazis had done during the Holocaust, but what the Soviet Union had done in the captive nations. And he called Soviet policy on Ukraine, and I'm quoting now, the classic definition of Soviet genocide. But when it came to enshrine the definition of genocide in international law, the Soviets had a seat at the table, and they were pretty determined that what they did in Ukraine and elsewhere would not fit the definition of genocide. They wanted the definition of genocide to focus much more narrowly on what the Germans had done in World War II. And so the key distinction then that the Soviets were able to get introduced into the legal definition was this idea that it's only genocide if you try to exterminate every member of a particular group. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to go too far down this road because I'm not an expert. But the Soviets understood, I think, that Lemkin's original definition would potentially put them in the dock or make them guilty for genocide. And so they didn't want to go along with that. And importantly, the rest of the world, Lemkin included, by the way, went along with the Soviets because they were desperate to get this convention against genocide on the books after the atrocities of World War II. And so I think we can imagine once again in the months and years to come, this question coming up again. And I just want to sort of remind us all that these definitions themselves, right, are come from exertions of political power in the past. So with that important footnote, I think, what are the prospects for bringing Russians to justice for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, for genocide? And the simple question I want to ask then is who's going to apprehend the responsible parties and who's going to try them? And the first question is the hardest one. That is to say, unless somebody actually conquers and occupies Russia, or unless there's some kind of liberal revolution in Russia that I'm not quite optimistic enough yet to predict, the possibility of apprehending the people responsible for this invasion and bringing them to power is almost non-existent. And so in contrast to the World War II cases, it's very unlikely that somebody will be able to arrest them and bring them to The Hague. And the ability to do so will be primarily based on military power, right? On defeating the Russian army and potentially occupying Russia. And besides the difficulty of defeating the Russian army to that extent, I don't think anybody actually intends or wants to occupy Russia the way we were determined to occupy Russia and Japan. In those cases, and there are other cases, of course, and Kristina mentioned some of them, but in the classic cases, there was this occupation and the goal of those wars was unconditional surrender. We haven't seen that in this war yet. The situation in Yugoslavia was more complicated and perhaps is a better example where, for various reasons, right, it did become possible. And there were actors in those states themselves with an interest in seeing some of those people arrested and brought to The Hague for trial. But I think I've made my point, which is it's very difficult to do this. And that is a pretty fundamental obstacle because as it stands, the Rome statute for the International Criminal Court states quite clearly that you can't try people in absentia. And they seem to have stuck by that. It's pretty unambiguous, and the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. Now, there are other entities that can try things, right? A court in the Netherlands just this week found 3 people guilty of shooting down Malaysian Airlines Flight 17. Those are 3 people, in the fighting in Eastern Ukraine in 2014, right? Not the people who were ultimately responsible for launching the war. And that's an important distinction. Now, and again, having found those people guilty, it's fairly unthinkable. It's very unlikely that the Dutch authorities are ever going to get their hands on those people and actually be able to put them in prison. And that's quite important. Equally worth noting that even if there's a change of power in Russia, like the United States, has never signed the statute for the International Criminal Court. And so before anything could happen, there would be a big fight over jurisdiction. And in that fight, the United States would have to be very, very quiet, or even take Russia's side, right? Because the United States is quite opposed to the idea that the International Criminal Court can try people from states that aren't parties to the Rome Treaty, or that it can go grab people anywhere on their own, because of course people in the United States are worried about it happening to people in the United States. So there are lots of obstacles, is what I'm getting at, and many of them are rooted in the power and interests of very powerful states. So if we think about justice, right, we think about finding people guilty, having official court rulings that they're guilty, and then hopefully having them incarcerated. It's conceivable that some actor or another can find various Russians, including the top leadership, guilty, but actually then bringing them to justice in the sense of putting them in a court somewhere and incarcerating people for what they've done seems to me still to be quite difficult. I think actually everything I've said so far is, at least in this section of the talk, is fairly obvious, but I just want to lay it on the table because for so many people, and Sophia conveyed this, I think, a little bit in her introduction, for so many people, it's of crucial importance, right? For survivors, for people who've watched this, for people who are worried about it happening in the future, it's crucial that justice be done. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to do it when the perpetrator is one of the most powerful states in the world. But I want to get onto my third point, which I don't think we've thought about as much, which is how the question of genocide might shape peace negotiations. And again, just to frame the basic problem, the governments of the West have not yet wanted to label this war a genocide, precisely because it would what it would obligate them to do. So already in the thinking of who we generally think of as the good guys in this whole conflict, the good guys are already, right, have their very particular interests put ahead of any notion of really pushing this question of genocide. And what I think is going to happen, what I would predict, and what I guess I should say I fear, is that the desire to reach a peace treaty is likely to see the question of putting those responsible on trial pushed off of the agenda, right? I think it's pretty clear that Ukraine is going to make some demands, has already made some demands about people being put on trial as part of a deal that ends this war. They will want anything from an acknowledgement of Russia's guilt to starting the war, to an insistence that people be put on trial, to insisting that Russia pay reparations. So there's a whole set of demands that can be made about the legal responsibility for the war itself and for what's being done in the war. But of course, the higher the demands go for a peace treaty, the less likely it makes it that the other side is going to agree. And we've already seen, especially from various actors in the West, pressure on Ukraine or recommendations to Ukraine that it actually makes some quite substantial compromises in order to get to peace, including giving away substantial chunks of Ukrainian territory. So I think this is going to be part of the negotiations, and I think it's one of those parts of the negotiations that Ukraine will be under pressure externally to let go, right? To say, let's get this fighting stopped. Let's not get these other issues in the way of actually getting the fighting stopped. And so to put it bluntly, I think we're going to likely be at a point where insisting on accountability for starting the war looks like it's a barrier to peace. And that's going to create some very difficult decisions. I think it will become particularly interesting in the case of sanctions. I think many people want to say, well, even if there's peace, we should keep sanctions in place until Russia turns over certain people for trial, right? The Russians, I think, are quite likely to say quite the opposite, which is part of any peace agreement to stop the war has to include a lifting of sanctions and a timetable to do that. And so I think sanctions on the one hand and holding people to account for what they've done on the other are likely to get connected to each other in any peace talks. So essentially then, to the extent that Russia remains a state and retains the power to prolong the war, it's going to retain the power to avoid being held responsible for genocide. And so that's really where I conclude. It's a truism that international law is constrained by power politics. That's also a somewhat trivial truism, but in this case, right, it's really going to shape the way we think about justice during this war and after this war. And so I think that the conversation that we're having is actually a conversation that's going to endure for some time, and I think it's going to end up leading to a fair amount of acrimony down the road. So I think I should stop there. Thanks, everybody. I'll be happy later to take questions.
Dr. Danieri, thank you very much for this articulate, very insightful presentation that brought up a number of issues to which I'm sure we will come back. And bringing the question, the most important question here at the table, of course, is the justice for the most powerful. And how we deal with that, as you remind us, will set us an entire world for a new global order, regardless of how we actually specifically depending on how we solve that. And that leads me to our next presentation, as it addresses the relationship between Ukraine and Russia and the Soviet legacy that those countries were dealing with for a while in a very different way. So here I'm presenting Dr. Gennadi Pobere̶ny, who will present on the TCG Triad as the key to understanding and overcoming the Soviet legacy. Dr. Pobere̶ny, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Great honor and pleasure to take part in this talk. Let me just preempt my talk by tipping my hat to Yurika Parulin, who is among the participants that are listening to our speeches, and just acknowledge that he is a scholar from Kherson, who was recently liberated, and that his Lemkin Center for Genocide Studies that he runs was inspirational model for initiative at the Ukrainian Free University to launch Raphaël Lemkin Center, a comparative center for colonial and genocide study that is not yet operational, but in the process of being formed. And I invite anybody interested in who studies Lemkin's legacy, especially his legacy concerning Ukraine, but also his contribution to the colonial studies, to consider participating in its activities and maybe partnering with. And I will get back to the Lemkin's legacy in response to what Paul previously said, but I will just start with clarifying what that triad I put in the title of the presentation. That actually TCG stands for totalitarianism, colonialism, and genocide. Right, so I will just briefly repeat the key. So the annotation for my presentation that was included in the program, just to say that the key to understand Ukraine's Soviet legacy is the intertwined nature of Soviet rule, where all three main strains were supporting, enhancing, and amplifying one another. Thus, the post-Soviet trauma was much deeper, more extensive, and lingering longer if there would not have been such a profoundly devastating combination. Nowadays, Ukraine has largely come to realize the consequences of its totalitarian past. It's still struggling to deal with its colonial vestiges, but is yet to fully grasp the fundamental nature of Soviet genocidal policies. which remain misunderstood and underappreciated. That prevents the Ukrainians from charting a course to overcoming those impacts. So what do I mean by that? Well, that is actually goes into Raphaël Lemkin's explanation of the nature of the Soviet regime in the same documents that Holodomor cited, which is the Lemkin's speech on the Soviet genocide in the Ukraine, as it was titled, which is often, what Paul cited is often cited, but it was attached to the Holodomor, not the entirety of the Soviet policies, which is not a mistake. It's actually completely skews the perspective that Lemkin tried to present. And in the second paragraph of that speech, he outlined the nature of Soviet regime as the attempt to create a new Soviet man, a new Soviet people, which went far above a specific policy in a particular fairly small period of time. Therefore, when we start talking about the nature of Soviet legacies and how much it affected the entirety of the population of Ukraine, we have to take into consideration that this triad of genocide, colonialism, and totalitarianism reigned for 7 decades of the entire Ukrainian population. And therefore, the casualties of that regime were not just those who died under its sway, but those who survived. And that's a majority of the population, but who had to adapt to it, internalize it, and essentially transmit the model of behavior, of identity, and everything else to the next generations, who again inherited that, internalized, and propagated again and again. So we're talking about 2 to 3 generations, depending on what part of Ukraine we're talking about, that were the victims of that regime. And as we now, based on the stated policy of the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainians largely come to terms with realization that the totalitarian aspect of that regime was clearly bad. It was clearly recognizable. And it was pronounced in 2015 by the series of laws adopted by the Ukrainian parliament, that was a bad period of Ukrainian history. It was very tragic. It was criminal past that needs to be condemned, needs to be overcome, and therefore significant efforts were put into explaining and dealing with this legacy in various aspects of Ukrainian society. As I would just remind everyone that totalitarianism is ideology and policies of total, as the name suggests, total control of the state over all aspects of private and public life of the society. That included not just the political arena, but also economy, social life, and everything else. However, the other 2 aspects are not as well understood and very often considered separately from the totalitarian past. The colonial aspect of the Ukrainian past is now obviously put in front and center, especially in the context of the ongoing aggressive war against Ukraine by its former colonial master, and therefore Ukrainians are becoming much more aware and attuned to the efforts of emancipating themselves from not just the Soviet Russia, but from Russia, whatever color it flies. Obviously, that has, the most prominent manifestation is the attempt to rename things that have connection to the Russian state or the Russian cultural institutional Russian cultural figures, or even geographical names that like streets named after other Russian cities or whatnot. Yeah, so, but very often it's still not quite accompanied by the context in which of explaining what that colonial legacy is all about, because colonialism is often just seen as, just another form of control. We now, and it was not clear whether or not the Ukrainians within the Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, were comparable to other colonial peoples. But what lacks here is the conceptual understanding that colonialism is actually about power asymmetry. So there is a dominant ruling group and the group that is being ruled. And the most important implication of that is that the most important strategic, but very often even tactical decision that concern the group that is being ruled over are taken elsewhere. And in the case of Ukraine, it was taken in Moscow, very often at the, at the Ukrainian expense, and very often against the interest of Ukraine itself. And the case of Holodomor is the most clear case whose interest people who were installed to run Ukraine were serving. Clearly, that was not the interest of the Ukrainian people. And that is just only the most egregious case. But it was going on for the entirety of the Soviet rule. So that conceptual understanding is lacking, and therefore very often, because of cultural ties and certain similar elements of culture, and obviously common past, that is being sort of argued against this clear understanding of the colonial aspect. But the colonial aspect is also important because the way Lemkin framed his concept of the Soviet genocide in Ukraine. For Lemkin, colonialism, for Lemkin, genocide was a colonial crime. And that's one of the aspects that did not make it into the convention that Paul mentioned. There are other things that did not mention, did not go into the definition of the convention that Lemkin suggested. I just mentioned two other things. Like, he was a universalist in a sense that he was not a big proponent of offering protection by international law only for limited groups, just 4 of them that find their way into the definition: national, ethnic, racial, and religious. He thought that expanding it to 4, it's actually narrowing it down from many more groups that potentially could be offered protection. And most important, the corruption of the initial Lemkin's idea was the introduction of the issue of intent to destroy in whole or in part of one of those 4 groups as such, which makes incredibly high threshold for prosecuting perpetrators of that crime. And of course, that is the reason. The reason for that is just Soviet meddling into this, and the necessity of Lemkin to essentially make a deal with Wyszynski and his clique, who was the notorious former Soviet prosecutor general Wyszynski, who was the deputy of the Soviet delegation in Geneva, where in '48, where the convention was adopted. But I actually not going to go into this in details because I spent quite a bit of time explaining how we should think and talk about, and not to think and talk about ongoing genocide in Ukraine. I did that in the previous panel in May. So if you're interested, I refer you to that presentation. I just want to move, and I have a few minutes left just to address this, the most misunderstood and underappreciated aspect of the Soviet legacy, which is a policy of genocide. Genocide, conventionally in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, almost everywhere, essentially everywhere, is primarily regarded as the crime of mass murder. And that's a problem with proper understanding genocide, because even based on the genocide conventional definition, you can commit genocide without killing a single person. Just look at the issue of transferring children from one group to another, or preventing birth in one group or another. So it does not amount to killing. So, which means essentially genocide is not just mass killing, it's about killing at all. Of course, genocide could be committed by mass killing of the entire population for a certain group, but essentially, it's not about that. It's about preventing a particular group that is protected by the convention from reproducing itself. In what, by what means it's committed, it's just a matter of opportunity. It depends on historical circumstances. But what it's required is symmetry of power, exactly that colonial aspect. One dominant group can do and impose its will on the group that is under its control. So essentially, by Lemkin's understanding, there are two things happening at the same time. On the one hand, there is a destruction of the basis on which this group stands, and imposition of the culture, rules, and everything else by the dominant group, or killing it all if that's the design. But it depends. And if you think about genocide as not about mass killing, but of mass violence, actually what Kristina previously referenced to, and actually very rarely we hear that genocide is talked about in terms of mass violence, but not mass killing. Yes, then we can say that, again, as with other aspects of Soviet rule, totalitarian and colonial rule, essentially everybody who survived the Soviet era in Ukraine are victims of genocide policy. Not just those who were killed or perished in the Holodomor, but the entirety of the population who dealt with this imposed Soviet Russified, or Russian for that matter, way of thinking about themselves, about the world. And it was pretty successful, I would say. It was very successful because of what kind of society Ukraine found itself in 1991, 1992, and it took 3 decades for the Ukrainians to starting to come to terms with the depth and breadth and length of that trauma. And that is still kind of coloring the perception of what's going on today in the occupied territories in Ukraine. Again, thinking about this more in terms of killing and the suffering and the manner in which the suffering is being inflicted, and not so much about other aspects. Although we see now issues like plundering of Ukrainian cultural artifacts, robbing museums, burning libraries, or transferring children from orphanages from the territory of Ukraine to the Russian territory and putting them up for adoption. So these things are finally being talked about. But unfortunately, these three decades also gave us additional barriers to think about genocide in those terms, because prior to the current events, Ukrainians primarily were conditioned to think about genocide in Ukraine through the prism of the Holodomor. In that sense, narrowing down the policies of the Soviet state just to that period and just to the great calamity and great number of people who died. And for that matter, just leaving everything else that explains what happened in 1932 and what happened after 1933. lingering somewhere. Not talking about genocide and colonial aspects as being intimately connected, as Lemkin taught us to think about. So these conceptual issues that I have to deal, and I assume most of you also have to deal each time you talk about those issues, and that is still being debated. It's still being reckoned with, and that's just still a long way for us to go in order to explain the Ukrainian. It's not so much about the Ukrainian past through the prism of totalitarianism, colonialism, and genocide. It's explaining the present and to deal with that in the future. Because Ukraine, I could say it's a post-totalitarian society today. It's becoming post-colonial society today, but it's not yet post-genocide society today for two reasons. One is genocide is being committed in the occupied territories of Ukraine. And second, the true legacy of genocide, Soviet genocide in Ukraine has not been properly understood. And if you do not understand, you don't see the magnitude of the problem, it's hard for you to devise a proper tools to overcome the legacy. So in that sense, it's a past-genocidal society, but not post. Well, I stop here, and I'll be happy to answer questions if you have any further.
Great, Dr. Pobere̶ny, thank you very much for this detailed account, and a reminder, an important reminder that we need to discuss colonial legacy and address the question that Russia did not address its colonial legacy, but instead glorified Stalin. And we saw evidence of mass post-imperial nostalgia, and it is indeed connected to what is going on right now. Just a few days ago, when Russian propagandists were watching the rocket strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure on a very large screen, Skabeva, one of the major ones, said, well, here's decommunization for you, right? In there is a celebration of its colonial past, its assertion of superiority of former control of Ukraine, and yet again, dehumanization of Ukrainians. So with that, I would like to turn to our discussion. And our first comment was by Maria Kravchenko, and she is sending us a very important reminder, saying that yes, we do have all the problems with electricity and refrigerators, but in general, Ukrainians are very resilient and flexible. Just some examples: surgery in blackout, the photo where the doctors with headlamps are doing kids' heart surgery. We buy power banks, looking for co-working with Generator, and planning our life according to the scheduled outages. And that is an important reminder, of course, that genocide and any genocide has unintended consequences that were unintended by the perpetrator. And in many ways, it is empowering the group at which the genocide is directed, and it's forcing the group to embrace the discourse about their identity. And for example, quite likely that if not for the Holocaust, Jewish people would have assimilated into the European community much more, but it brought a very different discourse about identity. Now, of course, does not legitimize by any means the genocide, but it is important to remember, and that is what Maria's comment is reminding us, that so of course, she says Russia should pay for all the atrocities, but as I see, our enemy can't break Ukrainians, cannot cause a real decadent mood and overwhelming humanitarian catastrophe, even using missile attacks every week. So I would like to Move on then to next question by Aubrey Eggers. Who's asking, because genocides don't happen overnight, when would you say that preparation for this genocide started? Was the Russian leadership testing the water, so to speak? Was the invasion of Crimea, or was it as far back as the early 2000s takeover of Chechnya? So here I would like to hear from perhaps Gennadi Pobere̶ny, since you address the historic element of Russia-Ukraine colonial relationship, what would be your answer to this?
I can only try to answer as a political scientist. I am not a historian. Genocide is relatively new, well, historically speaking, a new concept. And as I argued, still not very well understood. But according to Lemkin, who also very often credited with thinking about genocide in the context of World War II and extermination of the Jewish population, it's actually not accurate at all, because his thinking about genocide had some pedigree. I have no time to go into this, but most important causes that he was considering when coming up with this idea had to do with the Ottoman massacring of the Christians, not just Armenians, but also Assyrians and the Greeks. He was thinking about the Soviet policies, especially in Ukraine, including the Holodomor. So, and I just remind you that his seminal book, where he introduced the term genocide, appeared in Axis rule in the occupied Europe, appeared in 1944, when the extent of the German atrocities were not yet well publicly known. I underscore the word publicly. So it was not solely done in response to those atrocities, but his general understanding was that genocide is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for a very long time in various countries, especially autocratic empires. That was the modus operandi for them. And from that perspective, we look into the Russian case. I'd say Russian imperial existence pretty much the policy of genocide. One of the most atrocious, but also not very well known, is the extermination of the North Caucasus population, the Circassian, of which the world not only completely unaware of, but also went in 2014 to the town of Sochi, to the Olympics. And town of Sochi happens to be just a few miles from the place where the final defeat to the Circassians was rendered and obliterated any hope for them to survive as independent and sovereign state. So if you look at the imposition of the Russian imperial, not just power, but also Russian culture and language, and the methods through which it was done, and especially it was accelerated during the Soviet rules, I can hardly think when this policy was not genocide. And if you look back at the definition of the Soviet rule by Raphaël Lemkin to create genocidal, the core genocidal policy is creating a new Soviet man, a new Soviet people. Well, here we go. And apparently Russia didn't abandon its policy, or it's ideologically modified it. But Chechnya is obviously, to me, is an example of genocidal policies. And as far as its policy towards Ukraine, I'd say Russia always had the intent to eradicate the Ukrainians as a national group, just turn them into just another Russians. It just didn't have means to do so in the 90s. In early 2000s, it was not sure that the West would or would not intervene. But in the teens had decided, well, the West doesn't care, as Paul was making case for it, as much as it, it should fear. And now it had means because of the money provided by the West in exchange of oil and gas and whatnot. And they just went ahead, tested the waters, did it in Chechnya, but it sort of pretended to be internal affairs, went to Georgia, slip on the wrist, went to Crimea, not much different, and then finally decided it's now and never. So I can say when it started, but I would argue that it's never ended.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I'm just going to be very, very brief. I think it's just a really important question. I want to stress that. And I think there's many dissertations to be written trying to sort this out. I agree with everything Gennadi said. At the same time, I think there has been something very recent in Russia and in this war itself that sort of has metastasized. And I think it would be interesting to do a more thorough study than I've done, just of the transition of someone like Dmitry Medvedev from 10 years ago being sort of the liberal hope for Russia to being this genocidal maniac. That's on a much shorter time frame, and what's going on there is I don't fully understand it. So I just think it's a really important question. How do we get from that sort of deep structure that Gennadi points to? This has been around in Russian thinking for centuries, and certainly for decades, to the level of vitriol and violence that we see today.
Absolutely. And I would add here, actually, according to my research that I've been doing in the past several years, focusing on the Russian propaganda about the Ukrainian Revolution and Ukrainian society post-Maidan Revolution, we could see that in the past 8 years, Russian propaganda clearly fits the characteristics of genocidal propaganda that were seen by scholars. And so therefore, going back to Crimea, my answer is that already in 2014, Putin really showed signs of willingness to occupy Ukraine. And there was an attempt to establish the so-called Novorossiya, where a big part of Ukraine was to be occupied. But with that, I think in 2014, the Russian society was not quite ready for that, for such a blunt genocidal tactics as we see today. And so therefore, the past 8 years were preparation of Russian society with very clear dehumanization of Ukrainians, and therefore allowing for this to take place. So with this,
I'm sorry.
I would like
the infamous article on historical themes, probably authored by Putin last summer. No, I'm sorry, the summer of 2021, which most people, well, in Ukraine anyway, ruled out as sheer nonsense. A very important phrase at the very end, when he pointed out that from his perspective, the Ukrainians and the Russians are one people, which in genocidal terms meant one thing. It's not wishful thinking of somebody who is ignorant on the subject. It's a wishful thinking of somebody who has means to try to make it happen. So it's not the denial of the reality. It's the suggestion this reality needs to be changed. And what happened afterwards, it's a clear sense of how that was intended to change.
Thank you. And here I would like to turn to our next question by Yuri Kaparulin. He asks, does Ukraine now need a humanitarian intervention mission as an action to prevent or stop genocide? And I think this is a perfect question for Paul.
The answer is yes, but don't hold your breath. It's absolutely justified. I think it's extremely unlikely to happen.
All right, so then let me clarify that question then, I would add, and make you talk more a little bit about that. Is it just because of nukes? So essentially, are we sacrificing Ukrainians to the Russian gods in the hope that they will not touch us? And essentially, we are watching genocide in a reality show. We watch all the sufferings, we watch all the death, we know of mass graves, and we know of untold suffering, even by infants who are being raped in front of parents by the Russian forces. Does that simply mean that if not for the nukes, we would have cared more?
I think the nukes are a big issue, but again, recall Rwanda, which was quite horrific. There's a colonial aspect to that as well. Rwanda is in Africa, the people are Black, and I think there's a point to be made about how that shapes Western response. But nobody was afraid of getting nuked in Rwanda. So the nuclear weapons are part of what's deterring further Western military intervention, but simply the cost itself of the intervention is also a deterrent. I think without the nukes, we would probably be sending a lot more weaponry to Ukraine, but I don't think we would necessarily, I think it's unlikely, even without nuclear weapons or the nuclear threat, that NATO would be actually sending troops into combat in Ukraine against Russian forces. So I hope.
Thank you very much for
a more thorough answer.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying it. And something that, and I will just leave that as a thought here, something that I couldn't stop by wonder. Yes, Ukraine is not part of NATO, but neither was Sweden. Would the West care more if this was Sweden? Was that dehumanization narrative that Russia was successfully in many ways sending even to the rest of the world? Did we buy it into that because we're more likely to listen to the former empires rather than those who were formerly colonized? And we also, the West, by we I mean the West, buy into essentially into that message. And it's a rhetorical message. We do not, a rhetorical question, we do not know the answer, but I cannot help but wonder if the world knew more about the Ukrainian culture, knew more about Ukrainian civilization that Russia purposefully for years, as Gennadi reminded us, had suppressed successfully, would the West would have acted more because, as Paul Danieri is reminding us, nukes is not the whole story. So with that, I would like to turn to Jessica Zahovich's question. She says, she talks about the resources as a big part of it, and that Ukraine will reinvent the entire landscape of technological and fuel independence rapidly and by necessity. Former president of Lithuania has recently been speaking out about the military tech that was invented, upgraded in Lithuania during her rule. And of course, with the acknowledgement, she stated, it is a teaching battleground, but disgusts me that Ukrainians have to pay with their lives for the rest of the world's development. That is, of course, a very important reminder. And with that, Jessica is asking us a question. What are the links, if any, between resource scarcity and genocide in the 21st century? And that is an important reminder, right? As lots of media scholars, lots of media and scholars discuss this war so much in terms of the resources, but ignoring the attack on the Ukrainian culture with that. So do we have an answer to that? Or perhaps it's another comment for us to think about. Go ahead, Paul.
I would just point you, Jessica, to Tim Snyder's book, Black Earth, which
Yes, yeah, I know it. I've read it.
Okay, so maybe that's where your question comes from. So the answer is...
No, it comes from the term that I keep encountering, ecocide. in the media.
Yeah, okay. Snyder's argument, basically, he's looking back at the Germany in World War II and pointing out how much of what Germany did and how much of its rhetoric was actually based in scarcity, right? And particularly the scarcity of land, right? Lebensraum. But Snyder also wants us to look forward to say, what do we anticipate from a world of increasing scarcity and growing population? And, I don't see that actually in the Russian rhetoric of this war, but I keep on getting asked, right? Isn't this really all about oil? Isn't this really all about agricultural land? And so I don't know the answer to your question. I think this war is much more about territory as a symbolic resource rather than the economic assets that sit under it. But that's and of course about national identity. Because I don't think it makes any sense to do this economically or ecologically. But I get asked the question enough that maybe I should start rethinking that view.
Gennadi.
Yeah, my few cents on that is, yes, resources are always important, but in this particular conflict, it's not even secondary, it's tertiary. The most important thing is the matter of reasserting. It's not even so much about outside territories of Russia. It's about Russia itself, because Russian existential myth is based on Kievan legacy. That's where it traces its imaginary roots to. That's why the Ukrainians and the Russians have to be one people. Without that, the entire construction and the way the Russians think of themselves crumbles. And obviously, the resources help to withstand the pressure from outside the world. But it's essentially not about Ukraine. Ukraine is just a nuisance. It's about the way Russians would like to assert themselves and rule unopposed. And for them, they realize they need to change the world international order. So that's why resources come handy, obviously. But it's not primarily about that.
And another point about resources that very important to bring up, that Russia lost a tremendous amount of income from the resources that it cannot sell to the West, right? And while at first it's possible that Russia underestimated Western response, it became very clear already in the spring for the Russians that the West is serious, maybe not as serious as we need to in case of genocide, but they're serious and they're losing very important partners and buyers of gas and oil. And that the amount of money they're losing there, I would say, is far beyond whatever they could get from the stolen agricultural products in Ukraine. So that's an important reminder that it's not so much resources, but the ideas of suppression and genocide against Ukraine that is driving this ideological obsession despite all the resistance. And here
Ukraine is worth all the money in the world for Russians.
I think also, though, there's the idea that ecocide is global and that we are all killing ourselves because we're addicted to oil. And there are convenient constructions of ethnic others by leaders who want to monopolize and dictate. I don't know. I think that Greenpeace will have a different answer to the ideas of the links between human anthropological interactions and resources, and they would probably say the resources drive everything we do. But I don't know. I think it's an experiment. I think it's still an area of research that's opening up, because there's also the grid, the internet, the way Ukraine's grid is built is not the same as the way the US grid is built. It's still analog there, and there are structures that are embedded over information control that Putin would like. I don't know, maybe I'm sounding very speculative and futuristic now, but Paul.
Muted, you're muted.
Miroslava also had her hand up. I don't want to take up all of our time.
I was just saying goodbye. I got to get off to the airport. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I know Dr. Antonovich, I don't want to take up all our time with my question. You're muted.
You're muted. Miroslava, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. I have a short comment. If I understood Professor Danieri correctly, you said that ICC, International Criminal Court, cannot try Russian perpetrators because Russia has not ratified the Rome Statute. However, ICC can try Russian perpetrators of genocide or war crimes, crimes against humanity, because Ukraine has recognized jurisdiction of the ICC, and these crimes are committed on the territory of Ukraine. This is the first comment. The second, if I understood you correctly, you said that you consider that the way out would be negotiation with Russia. How can we negotiate with a terrorist state? I think that the only way out is to turn over the terrorist state. And if not now, then when? If we do not do it, if we negotiate with this state, then it will repeat again and again in the future. So this is my view. I will be thankful for comments.
Yes, thank you very much. So since we have, I'm so sorry, since we have just a few minutes, I would like to also read another question from David Fisher, and then we can address it together before we have to wrap it up in just a couple of minutes. So David Fisher is also asking, I understand why Ukraine's Western partners are reluctant to officially accuse Russia of genocide. What do you think explains the reluctance of, say, Western news media, social media, and other means of public expression to highlight the characteristics of genocide that the talks today have identified? So in many ways, those two questions have a lot in common. So Gennadi, would you like to address these, and then we will conclude?
Sure. Unfortunately, Paul left, but the comment that Miroslava addressed to Paul, I can safely answer on his behalf. He was not saying, Paul was not suggesting that Ukraine should enter into the negotiation with Moscow. He was conveying that is the prevailing position of the so-called realist or realpolitik school of thought. That's still do not believe that the complete defeat of Russia is possible or even desirable. And that presents a problem, because those realists still hold a very important power position within the countries that actually materially important for the continuing Ukrainian resistance. So I do not believe, I never seen him arguing for that. I am pretty sure he would argue against that, as much as I know Paul.
Okay.
And as far as the question by David Fisher, it's actually it's quite related to what I was trying to argue in terms of the perception of what constitutes genocide and what's not. Yes, at this point, the world saw Bucha, saw Izum, saw Liman, saw many other places in Ukraine with atrocities committed. But because the world, and including its media and academia and everything else, holds a very high standard, like a golden standard of what genocide looks like. And obviously it's the Holocaust. And Ukraine is not like that. And Russians are not building extermination camp on the mode that the the Germans did, and therefore you don't see the same kind of things, and that's very confusing. And when it talks about genocide, is again emphasis on mass suffering and torture and everything else, that does not square quite with the image of what Holocaust was popularized for. And therefore, genocide, is it really? And the confusing narratives that come from Russia that propagate its own version, fake news and various iteration of things to confuse people. So that comes together, and just sometimes it's even laziness of those reporters or commentators to seek the expert advice of how to think about things, everything genocide. And therefore, combined with what Paul was talking about, and Kristina was talking about, the necessity to do something about it. And that's obviously comes to kind of hits the wall. What do we do about the nuclear state? So that's why this rhetoric is dissipated and not very prominent and well articulated, I'd say.
Thank you very much for those important concluding thoughts. And of course, I would like to add here that perhaps one of the reasons that Western leaders and as well as Western media is not addressing the question enough or maybe doing less than needed, yes, perhaps because of the lack of knowledge of the situation or lack of full understanding of what is going on. And therefore, intellectual debates and sharing of knowledge as we had today is very important as we go on as a global society. And here, thank you from all the, on behalf of participants and the audience to the organizers of this intellectual exchange, Fulbright and Canadian Holodomor Center. So thank you very much, and thank you all who participated today.